Hello. Well, today what we're going to be doing is starting a new unit. In the previous unit, we've gone from 1877 to approximately 1920, and we've examined American domestic policies with respect to industrialization and the reaction to urbanization. We've talked a little bit about American foreign policy and how we evolved from our isolationist roots to become a major player in World War I. Today what we're going to be talking about is really the emergence of what a lot of historians, myself included, consider to be modern times. Okay? Now what I'm talking about is the 1920s. In a lot of ways, the 1920s are the first modern decade. In some ways, I guess you could make the case, the 20s are the first time period in American history that kind of see itself as a decade, as you and I would describe. But we are talking about a really important transition away from what we had been talking about with respect to progressivism. Now, for those of you that have been following along in the class closely, you know that there were specific people, people like Jane Addams, people like Ida B. Wells Barnett, and presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, that wanted the federal government to take a much more proactive role in regulating and kind of organizing American life. That will definitely change in the aftermath of World War I, and you see it very vividly in the 1920s. So before I go any further, what I need you to understand is, in many ways, we see kind of a reverting back to this time period where at least Americans thought it was much, much simpler. You didn't have this overactive American government that was regulating every minute aspect of American life. But we are also talking about a modern economy. We're talking about a modern society and a modern political body. Okay? So anyway, one of the first things that I'd like you to know about the 1920s is the standard of American living did go up. And when I say the standard, I don't just mean for the Rockefellers and the Carnegies of the world, although it was certainly a good decade to be rich. I mean for everybody. I mean, even the Jurgis Rutgeses, the working class of America, saw a general rise in the standard of living simply because we had mastered the art of production. I'll give you a great example of that later in the class, in the lecture I mean, when it comes to Ford and the Model T. But because we produce so much more, it means that prices are going to come down. We've got more supply, and more people, including the working class in the United States, is able to purchase these things. We also see an Americanization process that begins in the 1920s, and there's a few different reasons why. One is you do generally see a slowing down of immigration from places like Europe and Asia, primarily because in 1924, Congress all but stopped immigration, especially from places like Southern and Eastern Europe. And what that meant was you don't see as many waves of immigrants that are coming and reinforcing Italian culture, or Polish culture, or Jewish culture, Russian culture. And so you do see America becoming more and more American, if that makes any sense. And the stopping of immigration has a lot to do with that. Now, another institution that has a lot to do with that would be the emergence of the KKK, or I guess you could say the reemergence of the Klan. For those of you that took 1301, you'll know that the government did a pretty good job of stamping out the Reconstruction era Klan in the 1860s and 70s. What you see now is the rise of this new Klan that is much more sophisticated politically and has broadened its scope of hate. And what they're pushing is 100% American values. What they really mean is American culture, American society should reflect that of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. And so we'll see a lot of immigrants, or second or third generation immigrants, that are going to begin to shed their old world ways in the 1920s. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here before we move on is the fact that you are going to see the same old in the American economy. I mean, we're going to be a nation of corporations before the 20s, and we're certainly going to be a nation of corporations after the 1920s, but with an important twist. And one of those twists is you're going to see business and government kind of working closer and closer together. And I don't mean in the way that you might think I mean. I don't mean like in World War I, where the government basically told industry what it could do and how it could do it, I mean more or less a business-government partnership in that government generally makes a pledge to stay out of business, okay? What do I mean? Well, to describe what I mean with respect to the business-government partnership, let me give you the first president of the 1920s. His name was Warren G. Harding, one of my favorite presidents in American history. And he was from Ohio, and he ran against another guy from Ohio, James M. Cox, and together this was called the Ohio Gang. Harding, there wasn't a lot to love about him in terms of a remarkable politician. He was not an Abraham Lincoln, he was not a Franklin Roosevelt, he wasn't a Ronald Reagan. He was more or less an unremarkable politician, but the one thing that he was really, really, really good at was speaking, okay? As a matter of fact, one of the things that Harding would do throughout his political career was more or less just coin words in the English language. One of the words that he coined, allegedly, was the idea of vocal-cating. Think about that word, vocal-cating. What does it sound like? Vocal, right? Speaking. What he meant was articulating. Couldn't think of the word articulating, or maybe he had never even heard of it, but he just kind of played jazz and was inventive and came up with vocal-cating. But he did it with such confidence and he did it with such eloquence that it made people that were kind of going, huh? You know, what's he talking about? It made those people think that they were the stupid ones and that they should know what vocal-cating means. The other thing that I'd like you to know about Harding before we move a little bit further is his idea of a return to normalcy. Harding understood that the mood of the nation after World War I really wanted to get back to the day and age where we weren't involved in Europe's affairs and we didn't get involved in these bloody wars, these ghastly wars. And so Harding tapped into that popular sentiment and said, if you elect me president, I will return the nation to normalcy. In other words, our business as usual, especially as it relates to that isolationist roots, okay? Now, Harding is elected more or less by a landslide. So this really demonstrates that the Republican Party in 1920 is the dominant majority party. More people in the United States are conservative, are Republican-oriented rather than liberal or Democratic-oriented. Okay? Now, one of the things that I'd like you to know about Harding was that he was not very inclined to regulate the American economy. He felt that one of the best things that a president could do is just simply stay out of the American economy. Let people like Henry Ford do what they were best at, and government wasn't very good at doing Henry Ford's job. Don't tell Ford how many Model Ts he can produce or what he has to pay his workers. He's much smarter than the government. He's much better at determining those kind of things than any government would be able to do. And so what most of your Republican politicians, and certainly Harding would be one of these people, what they wanted the American economy to do is more or less self-regulate. Let the supply and demand, the invisible hand of the economy, the marketplace, let that determine what workers would be paid. We don't need the government involved in private affairs and telling people what they have to do. Now, the simple fact of the matter was, when you take such a hands-off approach to governing like this, it can be good, but it can also produce unintended consequences like corruption and cronyism. And one example that I'd like you to be mindful of would be the Teapot Dome scandal of 1922 that bled into 1923. There were specific chunks of the American landscape, you should remember this from the Progressive era lectures, that were put on reserve by the federal government. You couldn't touch them, you couldn't cut down trees, drill for oil, mine for gold, couldn't do any of those things. And one of those places was the Elk Hills in Montana. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that somebody within the Harding administration had secretly leased some of these oil reserves that were located in the Elk Hills to private drillers, which was patently illegal. And when the press got hold of it, it became a really big controversy within the Harding administration. I mean, it really took a toll on Warren Harding, so much so that through the combination of drinking and smoking and everything else that Harding was doing, all the stress that just kind of mounted on him because of Teapot Dome served to end his life prematurely. He died while in office in 1923, and the guy that takes over for him is more or less a mirror image of him, at least politically. That would be Calvin Coolidge. Now, the personalities of Coolidge and Harding, they vary drastically. They're very different people on a personal level, but when it comes to their political orientation and their general politics, these guys were very similar. When Calvin Coolidge was inaugurated, he swore that he was going to be the least president in American history. Now, he didn't mean the worst president. He just simply meant he was going to do as little as humanly possible when it comes to interfering with American life. He was one of those people that not only believed that the best thing that a president could do when it comes to encouraging the economy was nothing, stay out of the economy, he also believed that one of the things that made America great was you didn't have somebody standing over your shoulder morning, noon, and night telling you what to do and how to do it. Okay? So 1924, Coolidge is up for election, not re-election. He inherited the presidency. He's up for election. Okay? And for the most part, this is a sweeping victory. Those of you that are following along with me on the Politics of the 1920s PowerPoint, if you go to that election of 1924 slide, you're going to see a map at the top of the screen. It's a very, very red map. As a matter of fact, the only blue parts of the country, the only place where the Democratic Party really matters, that would be the American South. And there's not a lot of people that, comparatively speaking, there's not a lot of people that live there versus places like the Northeast or the Midwest. And so from the outside looking in, this really does look like a landslide victory for Coolidge and the Republicans. But if you look at that map, take a look at Wisconsin in the Midwest, right? Wisconsin's not red and it's not blue, it's green. The reason it's green is it didn't go to the Republicans or the Democrats, it went to the Progressive Party. We remember the Progressive Party traced its roots back to Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive politician. The guy that ran on the progressive ticket was a guy by the name of Robert Lafayette, who was one of the more famous progressive politicians from Wisconsin. And he was inclined to believe that the government needed to do things like regulate the economy, like at least put a bottom floor in terms of working conditions or a minimum wage or a maximum workday or things that were designed to protect people that could not protect themselves. And so the reason that I'm telling you this is the fact that Wisconsin, a relatively large state in the country, has cast its ballots for a third-party alternative. That's not nothing. That indicates that there are still people out there that believe the economy needs to be regulated and are dissatisfied with both the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to this issue of what kind of role government has to play in American life. But for our purposes, Calvin Coolidge's favorite sayings, or at least one of them, was that the chief business of the American people was business. And so he really didn't do a whole lot to interfere with private industry throughout his presidency. And if you just look at the numbers alone, from 1925 when he's inaugurated to 1929 when he leaves the White House, this is a very prosperous decade. This is a very boom time economy in American economic history. The boom is real. It's not superficial like a lot of people would have you believe, but there are fundamental problems in the American economy that are simply not being addressed, and we'll save that story for another time. What I'd like to do right now is talk a little bit about American politics through a social lens. 1920 is a really important year because that's the year that we ratified the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. 19th Amendment enfranchises, gives them the right to vote, and it enfranchises 51% of the American population. The way that I've always liked to think of this is the United States in 1920 dragging its knuckles into the 20th century. Places like Great Britain had given women the right to vote a long time before we got around to doing so. But I want to make something clear. The idea that women were voting were a long, long time before the Hillary Clintons of the world are going to emerge. Women are expected to participate in the democratic process, but we're not talking about voting for female candidates, okay? It was the expectation that mainstream male politicians would go ahead and take up causes that were near and dear to women's hearts. And one of the examples that we can point to that end would be something called the Shepherd-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act. Now, for your notes, the Shepherd-Towner Act, that'll be just fine. This is passed, or at least it's proposed in 1921, and all it wants to do is take taxpayer money, government money, and funnel it into institutions, some of whom are public, some of whom are private, to conduct more research to drive down infant mortality, babies dying, and women that died during childbirth. So you can see that this is something that's very, very important to women's health. And it's also pretty tame politically. I don't know that there would be a lot of you that would say, I don't want my tax dollars going to make sure that babies dying during pregnancy or childbirth. That's not something that I want to support. It gets defeated. Now, why does it get defeated? Well, the critics of the idea of taking public money and putting it into something like the Shepard-Towner Act called it socialized medicine, that this was a socialistic version of the practice of medicine. And if you said that in the early 1920s, or really any time during the 1920s, that was like calling somebody in Salem, Massachusetts a witch in the 1690s. It shred you of any kind of credibility. It destroyed the Shepard-Towner Act because it was akin to radicalism, to communism, to socialism. And we've already talked about the Red Scare and what that did to American life. So you don't get a Shepard-Towner Act, and consequently you don't really see a whole lot of progress when it comes to infant mortality throughout the 1920s. But over the course of the decade, women do kind of exercise their newly enfranchised rights, putting together organizations like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, which would put pressure on Congress to enact policies that were designed to make life in America a little bit better for American women. Now let's get back to our discussion on the economy. Like I said at the beginning of this lecture, in the 1920s we were a nation of corporations, big corporations too. But what you're seeing in the 1920s are massive conglomerations, right? Big corporations that were big before the war that buy up smaller companies and mom and pop shops to form these enormous, gigantic Goliath corporations like the General Motors Corporation. Now, if you think about General Motors, even today, it's got a lot of different brands of cars. You've got Cadillac, and you've got Chevy, and you've got Buick. There's a lot of them that have different badges, but ultimately they're still controlled by the same corporation. The General Motors Corporation traces its roots back to the 1920s and a guy by the name of Billy Durant. You don't need to write down his name. He's not going to be all that important, but I would like you to understand what's going on here. Before Durant comes to the helm of GM, Cadillac was Cadillac. It was an independent operating corporation. Chevy was Chevy. It was a different corporation. Buick was Buick. A lot of them were based out of different parts of predominantly Michigan, but the Midwest. When Durant comes to GM, what he does is he consolidates all of these companies and a lot more. A lot of them that you haven't heard of, like Studebaker or Oldsmobile or some of the other antiquated companies that were once upon a time a part of the GM family. He puts them under one corporate umbrella called the General Motors Corporation, and the government is threatening to sue him because he's in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which says that you can't be a corporation. Durant argued that not only did GM have to compete with Ford and Chrysler and other foreign automakers, they would also have to compete with each other. In other words, Cadillac would have to compete with Chevy, and Chevy would have to compete with Oldsmobile, and Oldsmobile would have to compete with Buick, and so on and so forth. But anyway, what I'd like you to understand about conglomerations like General Motors is they gave corporations an unimaginable level of power, right? I mean, they had a lot of power before World War I. They're going to have considerably more after the war ends. And one of the things that corporations are trying to do during the 1920s is make their shops 100% union-free. They don't like workers forming themselves into unions, and they're going to do their best to keep them out. Now, keep in mind, this is much easier said than done. So if you're going to encourage workers not to join a union, you're going to need to give them a reason as to why they would want to do that. One of the reasons that corporations gave workers was something called welfare capitalism. Okay? Now, for your notes, what welfare capitalism was was the idea that the corporation was going to take care of the needs of the workers. So in some instances, what you would have are corporations that would sponsor baseball and softball teams, bowling leagues, provide recreational outlets for their workers, which clearly increased their standard of living. In some cases, what they would do is they would actually co-sign for home loans. So there are some workers that are beginning to become homeowners during the 1920s, primarily because corporations like U.S. Steel have gone ahead and said, we will guarantee that this loan is repaid, even if the average Joe worker that's taking out the loan, even if he defaults on it. So this is the idea of welfare capitalism. It's the corporation kind of caring for the day-to-day needs of the people, and it's all designed to make the worker, write this down, make the worker loyal to the company. Do everything in your power to keep that worker loyal to you and suspicious of outside institutions like a union. Okay. Now, another issue that I'd like you to be mindful of would be the idea of new capitalism. Okay. Now, new capitalism was new in a lot of different ways. It was new in the sense that by 1920, we're no longer a producer economy, we're now a consumer economy. Now, just so we're clear on this, a producer economy would be something like oil or timber or steel, things that you need to produce, things like buildings, bridges, railroads, that kind of thing, right? A consumer economy is exactly what it sounds like. It is an economy that functions when me, you, us, we go out, we spend money on things like furniture or cars or homes or lawnmowers or things that things that you use for your daily life. Okay. Now, it's new also because we have a new way of producing in American life that provides infinitely more supply. And every time that you can increase the amount of supply, you're going to decrease the price. Anytime anything is more plentiful in an economy, it's going to make the price go down. And so what I'm getting at here is over the course of the 1920s, you had people like workers that are affording or able to afford what before the 1920s would have been considered a luxury item. Radios. Radio ownership is exploding in the 1920s, and well, really there wasn't such a thing as radio before the 20s, but in the early 1920s it was considered more or less a luxury item. Only rich people had them. Things like toaster ovens, some makeshift refrigerators, or at least things that were much better at preserving food than what had been seen heretofore. All of this is involved in the new capitalism, and when corporations were employing hundreds and thousands of people at a time, this was considered to be paramount in terms of keeping that economy spending, because the consumer economy can only function when consumers go out there and spend money. Okay. Now we need to talk a little bit about the industrialists and approaches that they took when it comes to organizing their factories. One of the first persons I would like you to be mindful of to that end would be a guy by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor, Frederick W. Taylor. Now, if you had to describe him in the 21st century, you would probably call him an engineer. He was a guy that studied the process of production. Let me give you a quick for instance. There was once upon a time when cigar rolling was considered to be very skilled work, highly skilled work, and it took a very skilled, very highly trained worker to perform that work. And that being the case, cigar rollers commanded a lot of not only money on the job, but they also commanded a lot of control. They were able to dictate terms to their bosses because the boss didn't know how to roll a good cigar. What Taylor would do is he would, in some cases, literally stand behind a worker. I don't necessarily mean a cigar roller, but somebody, and just study what that worker did from the beginning to the middle to the end. And when he had the data, he would take it up to his office, and he would try to shave seconds off of minutes, and shave minutes off of hours, and shave hours off of days. In short, what Frederick Winslow Taylor gave us was something called scientific management. It was a way of making factories and mills run much more efficiently. Find a way to, maximize cost savings. Find a way to minimize the amount of time that one worker is spending on producing one product. Find a way to make everything run smoother, quicker, and most importantly, cheaper. Scientific management, the ultimate goal was to reduce the overhead operating costs of producing. And this translated into a real benefit for everybody involved. I mean, clearly the corporation that was scientifically managing its production benefited from this, but so too were people out there in the American economy that were now paying less for things like cigars. I guess cigarettes would probably be a much better example. But anyway, you get the point that I'm trying to make. Another individual that I need you to be mindful of when it comes to this process of a second industrial revolution would be Henry Ford. Now, despite what Henry Ford would like you to believe, he did not invent the car. He didn't really even invent the idea of the assembly line. I mean, there were people that were using an assembly line in places like Cincinnati, Ohio, a long time before Henry Ford built River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. What Henry Ford really did was give us what we call Fordism, right? The word Ford and ISM, Fordism. Now, Fordism means a couple things, but what I really want you to understand about Fordism, it was about paying your workers enough money to buy the things that they produced. So in the case of Henry Ford, pay them enough money to buy a Model T Ford, okay? Why? I'm willing to bet that many of you have part-time jobs, maybe even full-time jobs, and at your place of business, they may give you an employee discount. I've worked in places that has given me an employee discount in the past. Now, why are they doing that? Are they doing that just because they like you so much? Well, that's part of the explanation, but the other part is they want you to buy the things that you're familiar with, right? I mean, who better to market a Model T Ford to than a Ford worker who was producing them every day, would love to buy one, just simply didn't make enough money to buy it. So, to that end, in 1914, Henry Ford really revolutionizes American industrial relations when he issues something called the $5 day. Now, $5 seems like maybe not even lunch money to some of us in this day and age, right? But $5 was an extraordinary amount of money back in the 1920s when you're talking about what a workman, an unskilled worker, would be paid on a day-to-day basis. And more importantly, these $5 that you would get a day, there would be more than enough money to buy things like a Ford Model T car, to buy a home over the course of time and put all the latest and greatest gadgets, labor-saving devices inside that home. And so the other thing that Fordism means is cranking out an extraordinarily large amount of produce. So if you think about it, you've got the best of both worlds. You now have workers that are making more money because Henry Ford wants them to buy the products that they're producing, and they're actually producing more products. And so I'll give you a quick for instance. In 1914, Ford was cranking out quite a few Model T Fords, but by 1920, one was rolling off the assembly line at the River Rouge facilities in Dearborn at a rate of about one every minute, right? So they're producing enormous amounts of Model T Fords, and what that's doing is it's bringing down the price. So now you've got more workers with more money that are paying less for their day-to-day products, and it's producing a situation where they can spend money on other things, including themselves. They're able to invest in themselves. That's the essence of the consumer economy that we're going to be talking about in the 1920s. But again, there are specific problems that we need to be mindful of as the 20s progress that are simply not being addressed by the Harding or Coolidge administrations, or Hoover either, for that matter. I want to end with American foreign policy, or maybe a better way of putting that would be lack thereof. You do see business growth overseas. The United States was not the only place in the world that Ford sold or produced his products. But outside of American products being sold in every corner of the world, you really don't have a whole lot of interaction with American corporations or otherwise in other countries, okay? Why is that? Well, the short answer is the very sour taste that was in our mouth at the end of World War I. There are a lot of Americans that felt so strongly that we had no business in that war to begin with, that they simply wanted nothing to do with Europe or anything else for that matter at the end of the war, and they said, we want to return to our isolationist roots. We want to go back to the way that things were before the emergence of the 20th century. maybe the one kind of anomaly, oddball out, if you will, when it comes to these policies would be the Dawes Plan. Okay. Now, the Dawes Plan was enacted by an American banker, or it was proposed by an American banker, that really understood how important European export markets were to the American economy, and understood that when the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany for the war, it was pretty much going to sink the German economy, and they would not be able to buy stuff from us any longer. So what he wants to do is he wants to have American bankers loan money to the Germans. And the Germans are going to take this money, they're going to pay it to the British and the French as war reparations. Remember that one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles did was it made Germany pay not only for the German side of the war, but the French and the British side too. Now, the French and the British are going to take that money, they're going to use it to rebuild their society and their economy in the aftermath of the war. And theoretically, anyway, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to cycle that money back to the United States in the form of an export market. So by the United States loaning money to Germany, it's going to save this American export economy, which was a great idea in principle. The only problem is, as Germany gets deeper and deeper in the 1920s, it's having trouble just paying that reparation to begin with. It's having trouble feeding its population. And so as you might imagine, fewer and fewer times Germany is doling out money to France and Britain, and they're beginning to default on those loans. Now, this isn't something that's going to happen sort of all of a sudden. It's a very episodic kind of experience. But ultimately, what's going to happen is when Germany defaults on those loans, France and Britain aren't going to be able to afford to purchase American products any longer, and therefore what you're going to see is a loss of an export market. And as you'll find out, this loss of the export market is really going to be paramount when it comes to a coming of the Great Depression. Okay? All right, so that's more or less what I wanted to talk about when it comes to the politics of the 1920s, and now what we're going to transition into is the culture of the 1920s. And as you'll find out, as I began this lecture talking about, the 1920s is a very recognizable time period from a modern standpoint. So that's where we're going to pick it up.